Welcome to Intention, an audio podcast focused on transforming the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Susan Gray, purposely introducing reflective questions that hold us in a state of tension to explore timeless work, life, and leadership contradictions. Join me each week as we grapple with our collective leadership responsibility to ignite a new, intentional way of human well-being in our workplaces. Welcome back, and thank you for all your comments, our offline discussions about last week's podcast around a new era of leadership. This week, I'm still thinking about leadership and what it means to lead in a landscape of increasing ambiguity and complexity. As an organizational change consultant to Fortune 500s, I spend a lot of my time chasing learning curves, thinking about habit-building behaviors, how we are motivated intrinsically, and the brain science behind our ability to disrupt ourselves. And in our last conversation, I introduced language, as in the ways we communicate, as an influencing factor on human behavior. And I shared a quote from Peter Block suggesting that how we speak and how we listen, how we approach conversation, and the kinds of conversation we are willing to have as the essence of culture change and transformation. So I thought I'd bring in two of my colleagues this week to continue exploring. Let me introduce Andre Kotze first to speak to the power of dialogue in creating change. Andre is the founder of Airtime, focused on the importance of verbal interactions and conversations between people as they navigate market conditions and workplace pressures. Andre, welcome, and maybe you can say a little more about Airtime and your professional focus.
Sure. Airtime BA is a behavior science company. We essentially study what people do, how they think together, what they do when they think together. We have a number of different behaviors that we can catalog and code in the process. And how people use their behavior then is something that we can look at in contrast to the result that they generate. And if they want to change the outcome of the conversation, we help them look at the behavior that produced the outcome and help them think about how they can change what they do to produce a different set of results. And all of that is dialogic and focused on things that matter to the business.
Thanks, Andre. It's such a critical time right now for change and transformation, right? For understanding individual behavior and collective action inside the container of work life specifically. And I love when we get the opportunity to chat because, one, it's always authentic, and two, it typically raises an opportunity for us to sit in tension with some aspect of people-to-people interactions. So when we look at group dynamics, when we look at bringing people together to actualize a shared vision or goal, what's the impact of complexity and stress and disruption on the ways in which we think and connect through conversation? Share with us how you are approaching the work that you're about.
I'm interested in giving people a window into how groups think together. And at all times, but particularly under duress, particularly. Because that's generally when conversations matter the most. So what can get people stuck is a position, a set of ideas that they hold on to and that they reinforce in any one conversation. And through behavior, or through what we do, can we actually get that conversation unstuck? Can we use a completely different set of behaviors, way of interacting, that opens the conversation up? I'm wondering, Sue, if you remember, what is the rarest behavior that we generally code? Do you remember what is the rarest behavior that we code?
Is it inviting in?
Bringing in. No, it's not bringing in. It is seeking reasons. Seeking reasons. That's interesting. Why do you think that way? Seeking reasons means we are holding something in tension. So it might be our own thoughts about what should happen. I'm holding that intention to understand your thoughts about what should happen and why. I'm exploring your thinking, and I'm doing that with a behavior.
Why are you interested in this? Why is it something that has caught your attention to study and understand how groups are thinking and how they're behaving, especially under duress? Why?
Yeah. Goes right back to growing up in South Africa. When you watch society unable to have a conversation with itself, it gets pretty ugly. And I grew up in such a society.
Now, as a South African, Andre is referencing apartheid and the challenges and the stress and the destruction and trauma that comes with racial division and abuse of hierarchy, and when policies reflect and influence emotions like fear and confusion and ultimately disconnection within humanity. And while I'm not overtly focusing this podcast on systemic discrimination, I am exploring power structures and practices that hold identities in place within the work environment and the urgent need for disruption through social change. I am curious about the influential impact of rhetoric and the stories we tell ourselves or that we tell other people, or stories we harvest by listening to others, right? Stories we hear around us in the container of organizational life. And I'm always grateful for conversations like this with Andre that remind us how conversation is typically at the core of our ability to align and awaken a desire for collective action. Right? The power of shared stories can either disrupt or preserve the beliefs we hold and the action we take. The end of the Peter Block quote I shared last week says, if we want to create change in our culture, the work might be to change the conversation to one that forces us to question the value of our narratives, especially when we are in intense times, or as Andre said, in times of duress. That's where the conversation might matter the most. So let's take a look at how stories get crafted and perhaps who crafts them and how they're sustained over time, especially within organizational or work life. I'm going to invite another colleague in to share what he's seeing with corporate clients and influential organizational leadership teams as he consults with them around the world. But before I bring him in, I want to share some information and a story with you as part of this conversation. You see, the research tells us that our brains are hardwired for story, that we think and remember and experience everything through story. But it's only relatively recently that we had the awareness of the impact of conversation, or had the tools to get curious about how our dialogue, our narrative, impacts the stories that get created and why story is so embedded in the human experience. If you think about before written language, the only way an idea or a thought survived over time was if it was impactful enough to be remembered and repeated, right? It didn't matter if it was positive or negative. If it had enough resonance with you, if it was sticky enough, if it could take hold of you enough, well, you were likely to then remember it and then spread it, right, from person to person as you told it, as you engaged in conversation. And this hasn't changed. Even with written language, we still hitch ourselves to the stories, placing our awareness or maybe our sense of self into the narrative, the conversations that we're having as we're sharing our emotions. So the more we're able to see ourselves in the conversation, in the story itself, the more we're able to invest ourselves into some aspect of the shared story, well, the stickier it becomes. A few years ago, the American government, the Department of Defense, created a research team of 48 neuroscientists to explore and understand how stories exert influence. And the results of this study were fascinating. Please Google this. The scientists debated and engaged many brain science concepts. They used tools like cardio monitors. They were measuring oxytocin and dopamine levels to understand how stories are first recalled and how they influence behavior and the impact of time on the influence of the story. And one insight that came out of this study is that for stories to be influential, they need to engage you at an emotional level. The more emotional attention the story captures from you, your brain, the more likely you are to be influenced by it. No surprise. Another insight that came out is around relevance. The more you perceive a particular story as being relevant to you, or the narrative has relevance for you, the more likely you are to be influenced by it. But why is this true? Well, it turns out that any information, any data coming in through your senses, before it reaches your conscious mind, is turned into a story. Let me say that again. Any incoming sensory data is turned into a story form before, not after, it reaches your conscious mind. There is actually a fixed, connected set of subconscious subregions in the human brain that works to create and process data. It's called a neural story net, turning it into a meaning-making story as it moves from the specific sensory organ to the conscious brain. And if your brain cannot make sense of incoming data in this specific story form, it will not pay attention to it. So you literally distort information as you receive it to make it make sense to you. Your brain is filled with biases that help you make assumptions, overlook or select particular information, infer connections, presume motivations, and interpret, or more often misinterpret, what's coming in. So every single one of you listening to my voice, in order to make what I'm saying make sense to you, will augment, invent, reinterpret, distort, completely reverse, and ignore some of what I'm saying to make it make sense to you. So whatever information makes it to your conscious mind gets delivered as a self-created story. That's not the same as the data that your sensory organ brings into the body. So we each participate in the world around us as subjective sense makers, right? As story creators. And every accomplished writer, well, we can probably do this too, can recall the elements of a story. Perhaps you learned these either formally in elementary or grammar school, depending on where you grew up, or just by listening or reading stories, right? There's a character with a goal or a dream or a hope or a need. There's conflict, some problem, some danger, maybe a challenge. There's a climactic adventure with heroes who help or antagonists who might cause trouble, and it all moves towards this final resolution at the end, right? The elements of story are fixed and they're known. But what you might not understand is the brain science behind each of those elements, as in what's happening in your brain in this neural story net when you interact with data. You see, your brain is already constructed to look for each of those elements. And if any one of them is missing, it works to create it and fill in the gap. Maybe a good way to think about this, or a good visual, might be these toddler toys where you have a shape, a triangle or a square or a circle, and the toddler picks up the shape and tries to fit it into some matching construction, a square, a tower, a cylinder, and you might try and fit the triangle into the circle opening. It doesn't fit. You might take the triangle and try to fit it into the square opening, but it doesn't fit. But if you take the triangle and fit it into the triangle opening, then there's a match. It clicks, it falls into place. And it's the same thing. Metaphorically, your brain has this built-in space for you to engage at an emotional level with incoming data in the form of story. As the data travels to your conscious brain, it's being sorted into those elements. It's preparing to be dropped into the matching slots, if you will, in your brain, sorting through and closing any gaps in any part that's missing on the way. And the American government discovered that these elements are pretty easy to control when you know what the brain is looking for. So if you're trying to make a story impactful or powerful or influential in a particular way, well, you can do this quite easily for a human audience through the main character. what they call the identify character and what happens to the character at the end of the story, and the emotions that you associate in relation to that main character at that resolution. This is the greatest factor driving the influence capability of the story. Now, a character doesn't need to be a person for you to have a relationship or see yourself within it, right? Organizations can be characters. A country's reputation can be a character. Global health could be a character. I think part of the genius of classical narrative structure is that it's incredibly flexible within broad constraints. So story elements can be found in anything. Finding your life partner or your spouse can be the resolution. Losing that spouse could be antagonistic. Innovating a product and developing the right launch campaign could be heroic, or it could also be an obstacle to overcome. Losing respect, gaining fame, working from home could all be challenges or the final outcome. And there are limitless ways in which allies and villains show up in the story, right? Your Facebook followers, your salary, your credit score, new co-workers, mentors, managers, competing industries, supply chain, customers, bureaucracy, or HR practices. So these elements hold regardless. And these neuroscientists were able to create an influence model from the findings in this study based on understanding that if you can embed relevance and identification, then you can start to nudge meaning making in a particular direction and influence emotion. Because it turns out story is not content. Story is the way you structure the framework on which you hang your content. It's a way of planning and thinking. It's a way of communicating in conversation our beliefs and values that support the action we take, what we actually do. And I want you to remember this because I'm going to come back to it later when we make a connection to leadership and the historical role leaders have had as the people in our organizations, maybe even society at large, who structure the framework on which we hang our content. Leaders as the strategic thinkers and planners. Leaders who dream up or ideate a vision and the mission that we, the people, accept to help align to and achieve that vision. When this research study, when the neuroscientists was complete, those who had access to the results included some progressive and wealthy organizational leaders, right? They were privy to some fascinating tools with which to now craft and formulate influential stories. You think about when social media was created, Facebook and Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. This is your story on blast, right? Tell us your story. Or maybe it was more accurate to say, tell us your story as you're interacting with the story you're experiencing around you in the world. So it's almost like a story or many stories within the story. And what's interesting about the human brain is that our need for meaning making is so hardwired that we will even alter our recall or memory of events to make them fit what we think makes sense in the story. Memory is also an act of creation, right? Your memory of the last team meeting or of our last leadership offsite will differ from mine. In your story, you're the hero, and in mine, I'm the hero. But who or what we are saving depends on the motive in the story, doesn't it? So let's recap. I want to get Bruce in here. Every experience you have wants to be a story. And the more you are given a story that's complete with the hero, the struggles, the emotional resolution, and it has relevance and you can see yourself, the more you get a predefined, ready to drop in story, the easier it is for your brain to assimilate it into the hardwired story frame that exists inside your brain, and you have less work to do in terms of filling in any missing gaps. And there's tremendous power in knowing how easy it is to craft an influential story that has relevance and identification and this predefined meaning. Right? The more we follow a fixed structure, these story elements, the more we code and communicate in conversation these stories just right, then it drops nicely into the human computer brain. And once it's there, well, we will work to sustain it, even ignoring or reinterpreting contradicting information that doesn't fit. Once it is in our conscious mind, it means we have already inserted ourselves into the story because we identify or we can see ourselves in the character. And we're emotionally attached to the outcome, to the resolution of the story. It affects us personally. It's sticky. It has a hold of us. And so we share it, right? We spread it from person to person, even passing it from generation to generation. Our stories anchor us, they shape us, sustain us, and have the power to disrupt or inspire into some form of action. And listen, I want you to understand, I don't need to be in the story or live it from your perspective in order to sustain it. I can still be the hero in my story and see your experience as the antagonist in my story. Or we can be heroes together, right? I can have my adventure as you're experiencing your resolution in the story. Perhaps your resolution triggers my obstacles and challenge, but the story still holds. Right? You think about films and cinema. How many of you, when watching a movie with your friends or your family, even discuss or imagine which character would you be in the story, right? You want to relate. Are you Maverick in Top Gun, or are you Goose? Are you Cinderella, or do you identify for some reason with Cinderella's stepmother? It doesn't really matter. It's kind of irrelevant, because when something happens, right, we all gasp in unison. We all kind of hold our breath when the plane crashes on screen in Top Gun, or the prince shows up with a glass slipper to find his love. We relate. We are now in the story together. It has a hold of us. So stories matter. They change the way we think and act and feel. And when enough of us share the same story, think about our organizational life, even through or from our various subjective perspectives within the story, well, culture is born. And culture is story. It's the frameworks we hang our content on. It's heard in the conversations that we have with ourselves and the stories we repeat to each other. It's the way we do things around here, because the way we speak and the way we listen, as we heard earlier from Andre, is anchored in our mindset and the actions that we take. So now let's rewind to the start of this podcast and our focus on what it means to lead in a landscape of increasing ambiguity and complexity. Let's get curious about the impact of uncertainty and relentless change on our collective story of leadership and organizational life. What stories have been reinforced or challenged by a global pandemic, by daily digital disruption, by the merging of our personal and professional lives, and our historical narratives on when and where and how work gets done and who does it. I'm going to pull in Bruce Landry to our conversation to share his perspectives on how organizational cultures are being transformed and the work he's been about over the past year as Chief Experience Officer at Canvas. Canvas is a transformative leadership community, and Bruce spends his days traveling and consulting, facilitating strategy and leadership development for many large international organizations. Welcome, Bruce. For decades, we've spent so much of our time working on the individual, and we've largely ignored the culture in which we've asked them to lead. Share with us what you're seeing. What is the leader story now?
I think the story we've told ourselves is that leaders have a role to create something, or leaders have a role to be at the front of a charge for an initiative, or at the front of change, or they play this special role. And there's so many stories in our over history around the role of the heroic leader. But I think today, as it has always been, the role of leadership is to create a space where people can thrive, to create a space where people feel included and feel like they belong, to create a space where they can see themselves in the story that they're a part of. I think really good people, really talented people, migrate to other organizations when they stop being able to see themselves in the story. They stop being able to see themselves as a character and as a contributing member to that play or that story.
Now, none of us have a crystal ball, but we have hung our hats on, chasing trends and understanding what's happening around us. Where is this going, Bruce? What do you think? Where are we heading?
There's this tension right now between organizational need and human need. And I think the best organizations and the best leaders will be able to make both of those things happen. They'll be able to hit profit margins. They'll be able to hit financial targets. They'll be able to serve their clients and customers while at the same time creating an environment where those human beings thrive. Because I think if one thing that the pandemic did for humanity is we took inventory of what's important. We took inventory of what story we want to be a part of. We took inventory of shaping our lives in a more direct way. And leaders need to recognize that. There's the command and control and the, show up and do this and do that. Those days, of course, are long gone. And I think the best leaders and the best organizations are going to create a story where people can thrive on every level.
Now, when you say this word thriving, Bruce, it begs the question, whose definition of thriving, right? And how will it be, or how is it measured?
There's some part of this future narrative in this story where leaders are going to have to get comfortable not having as much control. A big challenge for leaders is to recalibrate what oversight looks like and what control looks like, and begin to embrace a story where people are thriving in ways that are not traditional to a corporate environment, and allowing people to kind of create their own story for them personally as human beings, right? Many professional stories today include those things I cited, include balancing some of those personal aspects of their life during the day, not fitting them into the edges of a day or a night or a week.
I know you just returned from an offsite working with an executive group of a major global brand. Can you talk a little bit about what are the mindset struggles folks at that leadership level, or any leadership level, are grappling with?
Well, each organization's, of course, different. This organization has some new members to their leadership team. They recently just upgraded their physical offices. So there's that dynamic, just built a really nice space, and pre-pandemic, thinking that was going to be where everybody works. And so there's a lot of needing to disrupt the way they thought it was going to be. There's a lot of disrupting, not just how their organization is working, how they're working as a leadership team and how they're working internally, but disrupting how they're serving their clients, how they're connecting with their businesses, how they're working with their business units.
Are they aware that this is a disruption to their original story? Is story coming up? Are you hearing any culture searching or seeking or transformation?
Yeah, I think to a large degree, most of our leadership team clients that we work with, they are aware of the disruption. What's interesting is that they're trying to recraft the story using many of the same tenets of the old story. They're trying to re-engineer how they work. They're trying to re-engineer their systems. They're trying to re-engineer their culture and their story. But there's a process of letting go of that old story and the way it was, and really embracing. It's almost like clearing the whole desk, cultural desk, if you will, or the systems desk, if you will, and thinking about, okay, given this new reality that we're working in at every level, internally and externally with the market, how do we need to shift that story? What does value look like in our organization, and how do we communicate that internally and externally? What does an employee value proposition look like the way we're working today? So yes, I think most leadership teams recognize the disruption. I think there's a process of letting go of the old story to craft the new one.
Is that difficult? Are they struggling with that?
For sure. Absolutely struggling with it. A lot of neural pathways being rebuilt, a lot of letting go. And and if we really want to get down to it, there's a lot of personal identity wrapped up with how the stories that we used to tell each other, the ways we used to work. There's a lot of personal identity with the clothes you put on every day, and the process of getting to work, and the space that you live in, and the people that you see every day. And so there's this recalibration and this shifting of story around, okay, so if I never leave my house and I'm working in my home at my home desk and I'm on Zoom all day, do I still feel like I'm that same person that went up to the 53rd floor and spent the day in the city or wherever that may be? So I think that's a process that's incredibly hard for people on a personal level, but it's also hard for organizations.
And these leaders, as they're grappling with some of, whether it's personal story within the story or the organizational culture story, where does the rest of the workforce fit in? Are they included in that reshape? How are they bringing those stories in, or are they ignoring those?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, right? I mean, the different organizations are looking at it differently. I see organizations trying to engineer this from closed-door sessions with the leadership team or the board, and time will tell whether that's effective. I see other organizations taking that step, but also including every aspect of the organization in a way that people feel as though they're crafting that story. Again, they feel as though they're authoring what this new story looks like. And the interesting bit is that most leadership teams don't have a good enough handle on the current story or the current culture to do that themselves. If they don't reach out into the organization, if they don't gather the qualitative data story that is currently at play in the organization, then they don't even have a good line of sight into what we're moving away from if you're trying to craft a new story. So I think the best organizations and the best leadership teams are including the rest of the organization.
It's a lot, right? Because there's an awareness building or an acceptance or an acknowledgement of what is, to let go of, or to unlearn, if I can throw that term in there, to then move into a new future story.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the word that keeps coming up for me is letting go. People need to disrupt themselves before they expect to disrupt their organization. And if they can't do that, if they can't start telling themselves a different story, it becomes very difficult to shape a larger story in the organization.
Bruce, thank you. There's been so much packed into our conversation. Lots of insights, lots to reflect on. We are living inside a story of disruption and ambiguity and complexity. And this story has relevance for every one of us as we find ourselves in all the twists and turns as the story unfolds. And some of us are more aware than others that parts of this story may not even be of our own making, as social media and the world around us has offered us those story elements that are easily digestible in terms of sense-making inside our conscious brain, right? Amidst the confusion and the burnout and the uncertainty that many of us are experiencing, it is often easier to have something that is clear and concise, some meaning that we don't have to process too much, right? Our brain likes that. So it becomes really easy to hold on to or grab or assimilate anything that's offered, that's familiar and comfortable when you're in moments of distress. Yet, as we heard earlier from Andre, and you've also reinforced it, it is exactly in these times that conversation with each other, conversation with ourselves, really matters. You talked about organizational leaders needing to embrace a process of first letting go in order to shift into a new future. We've heard how leaders engaging in culture transformation work are realizing that they no longer have, if they ever did, enough of all the personal pieces impacting the collective story now to successfully craft a new one for the future in isolation, or one that will stick without including everyone. So maybe this opens up an opportunity for us to reflect on the role of leadership in our future, in contrast to what it has been or who we have thought of as leaders. Who and what is leadership for? Is it for the people, or is it by the people? And if it's by us, then how do we create a new framework to hang the content of a future collective leadership story on? What conversations do we need to have more with ourselves to think beyond the stories that have been playing on all of our background soundtracks for years? What conversations do we need to have with each other to seek and find a shared meaning in the merging of our personal and professional stories? And how can we continue to stretch our own reflective muscles to sit in tension with the opportunities and the challenges that change and disruption often bring? I want to thank Andre and Bruce and all of you for joining me this week in Tension, and I look forward to continued conversations and hearing your stories offline.